What is up, guys? Kevin JSI back with a brand new video, and today I'm going to be talking about 2020 in gaming. Now, as many of us know, 2020 was quite the controversial year when it came to gaming, most notably surrounding The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 was a very torn game in the video game community, to say the least. People seem to either absolutely love it or absolutely despise it. And this really shined around the end of the year when the Game Awards came up, where The Last of Us Part 2 won basically every award it was nominated for. Now, at the time of the Game Awards last year, I had actually not played The Last of Us Part 2, so it wouldn't really have been fair to give my opinion on it at that time, but now, 6-7 months later, I actually have played the game along with many more of the nominees for Game of the Year, which is why I'm making this video now instead of 6 months ago, but I still think it's fun to talk about. So in this video, I'm going to be ranking 6 of what I think are the best games that came out in 2020 in 3 major categories. These games being Animal Crossing New Horizons, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Hades. You might be wondering, well, I'm leaving out one of the biggest games that came out last year, that being Doom Eternal. Now, the reason this game is not on here is not because I didn't like the game, it's just simply because I didn't play it. Doom is a shooter. I'm not really into shooters, to be quite honest. I'm not good at shooters. I'm just not going to be talking about it because it's not fair, and in fact it's impossible for me to share my opinion on a game that I haven't played. Regardless, I'm going to be talking about the 6 games in 3 categories, those being gameplay, story, and environment. Gameplay, of course, this involves how the game is played, arguably the most important part of a video game. Story, it's going to include story, side stories, character development, things like that. And the environment is basically everything else thrown into one, so things like music and visuals and whatnot. So without further ado, I'm just going to get started in the gameplay category. Coming in at number 6 is Animal Crossing New Horizons. The gameplay in Animal Crossing New Horizons is fine. It's simple, it's nothing overly complex, but when you compare fishing to what happens in the other 5 games that I'm talking about, it's not really comparable. Next up at number 5, I think there is a pretty big gap between 6 and 5. We have Final Fantasy VII Remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake does extremely well in the gameplay aspect, it's so stacked. The gameplay is super smooth, it's super fun. The thing is, it's just simple. I mean, you play a lot of action games and you can get very similar experiences out of it. The only reason that it ranks so low is simply because it's not unique. A lot of the other games have a lot more unique gameplay, and that doesn't mean that it's not fun, because a lot of games with this style of gameplay and sort of kind of like hack and slash are fun to play, like Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's not creative enough for it to rank any higher. At number 4, we have Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, unlike the first game, Ori and the Blind Forest, definitely takes a larger focus on combat rather than platforming, and I think they did a very good job at that. I love the gameplay in this game. Again, it's smooth, it's fast, and it just feels very satisfying. They do a very good job at combining the platforming elements and the combat elements to make a really fun adventure as a whole. Next up, at number 3, we have The Last of Us Part 2. Now, again, The Last of Us has some of the best gameplay out of any, series. This is a 2-game series, but still a series. It is unique, it focuses a lot on resource management, and you have lots of options with you can either choose to be stealthy or go right in and attack enemies. At the same time, it's the same as the first game. There are some differences, some different materials and whatnot, different enemies, but in the end, it's not new or different enough, I feel, for it to rank any higher. But regardless, it's still a very, very, very excellent game when it comes to gameplay. Next up at number 2, we have Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima and Last of Us Part 2, I feel, are actually kind of similar when it comes to gameplay, in that you can choose to go in silently and kill everything very quietly, or you can run straight in and, body everyone. So these two I felt were very, very close, but I just gave the edge to Ghost of Tsushima simply because it's newer, it's fresher, stuff like that. And at number 1, we have Hades. Hades, I believe, is the most replayable game I have ever played in my entire life. The gameplay is addicting. It has so many different options. You have 6 different weapons and different variations of those weapons to use. The combat is fast, it's exciting, and there are just so many different ways that you can go with this game. So for that reason, Hades is definitely at the top of my gameplay ranking. Moving on to story. Once again, at the bottom of the list at number 6, we have Animal Crossing New Horizons. Again, it's not that it's bad, it's very simple. It's kind of unfair, really, to grade Animal Crossing. You don't play Animal Crossing for the story, that's for sure, but it's one of the categories I made up, so I'm gonna rank it at the bottom. Coming up at number 5, we have The Last of Us Part 2. Now, The Last of Us Part 2, I think, gets way more hate than it deserves regarding the story. I don't think that it's god-awful. I think it's decent. The story, it's a story of revenge, and I understand that they made some controversial decisions regarding the story, especially around Joel and his death. But I don't think that the story was all that bad. And I think one of the biggest reasons why I didn't find the story to be all that bad is because I didn't hate Abby as much as most other people did. Don't get me wrong, I hated Abby when she killed Joel, but I think the effect that the game had on me was different compared to most other people, and that I actually grew to like Abby's character a lot more as I played her path. That effect, if you didn't receive that effect from the game, I understand why you think it was really bad, but I got that effect, so that's why I don't think that it's horrible. It's still, there's flaws in a lot of them, but I don't think that it's bad enough that everyone has to say, like, oh, the story in this game is atrocious. Next up at number 4, we have Hades. Hades' story is simple. It's not overly complex, and it doesn't need to be. Because of that, it's not going to rank super high on my list. There aren't really any flaws. It's not super ambitious, but it's still solid, and it's a nice, heartwarming story. Next up, though, at number 3, I feel like these top 3 definitely distance themselves from the bottom 3 story-wise, but we have Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I believe, story-wise, is an upgrade from the first game. The story is so emotional, especially for a game where the characters don't talk. But yes, it's just a very emotional tale. Ones that I was even tearing up at some points, and again, the characters and Ori himself is just so great. It's just, it's a great story, and again, it's not overly complex either. Next up at number 2, though, we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. I did have a little bit of trouble thinking on where to put Final Fantasy VII Remake, since it's not really a complete story, it's like a to-be-continued type thing, but regardless, Final Fantasy VII Remake had a lot of emotional moments, and it has my favorite characters out of any game ever. I love the characters in Final Fantasy VII Remake and how fleshed out they are, and how Cloud himself develops as a character throughout Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think is done so well. But yes, Final Fantasy VII Remake, like I said, it's not a complete story, so it's kind of hard for me to place it, but in the end, I think that the characters themselves really elevate the story to my number 2 position. And of course, that leaves number 1 with Ghost of Tsushima. The story in this game was fantastic. It was emotional, super emotional, it was powerful, and it really, really made you love the characters that are involved in it. Jin Sakai is a very, very, very well done protagonist, a very interesting, great character development, lots of great side characters as well, amazing side characters in Ghost of Tsushima, and of course the ending is spectacular. That decision at the end of Ghost of Tsushima really is the cherry on top to why the story in that game is so fantastic. But yes, that is my story ranking, and now moving on to the environment, which is, like I said, basically everything else you want to have in a video game, like visuals and music and things like that. At the bottom, once again, to no one's surprise, we have Animal Crossing New Horizons. Now, Animal Crossing New Horizons, you can't really expect all that much from it. It's a very simple game, and that isn't a bad thing. It's just because of that, I don't think that the visuals or the music really compares to a lot of the other ones, which is fine. Next up, we have The Last of Us Part 2. Last of Us Part 2 has a very dark environment. For me personally, I just don't think that it was good enough to really be any higher. It wasn't super unique, it's just a dystopian world. The visuals, of course, were great, but I thought the music was subpar. Nothing that really compares to the stuff higher on my list. Next up, we have Hades. Now, once again, the gap between 5 and 4 on this list are pretty big. I think that the top 4 and the bottom 2 are pretty big difference. But yes, Hades has spectacular music. I love the art style they went with for this game. It's just overall very, very well done when it comes to the environment and being immersed in Zagreus' journey. The characters, like I said, in the environment, I love all of their designs, and just the whole design of the game feels very fresh, very unique. Next up, we have number 3 with Ghost of Tsushima. The visuals in this game are fantastic. So many moments in the game you just have to take a step back and enjoy the view. Visually, this game is absolutely fantastic. The music is also very, very solid. It is very good soundtrack as well, but still not enough for me to rank it higher than my top 2. Coming in at number 2, we have Ori and the Will of the Wisps. The Ori series, I guess, has my favorite art style out of any game I've ever played. I absolutely love the visuals of Ori. It just looks so magical. It looks like a magical game. And on top of that, the music through the roof. Absolutely fantastic soundtrack. So yes, Ori and the Will of the Wisps ranks very high on my environment ranking. And of course, that leaves my number 1 spot to Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, Final Fantasy VII Remake is just, once again, such a pretty game to look at. I absolutely love the worlds that they built, and I feel like this is a little bit of the seeing the difference between the first game and then seeing it now in HD. And oh my god, just the whole Sector 7 and Midgar is just, it's breathtaking. It's absolutely amazing. And on top of that, I do believe that Final Fantasy VII Remake had the best soundtrack out of any game that came out last year. I absolutely love the soundtrack. Kind of cheating because they used a lot from the first game, but still, absolutely outstanding. And that rounds out my rankings for the for each of the 3 categories. But now I'm going to give some final rankings on what I actually think should have won Game of the Year last year. At the bottom, number 6, the worst of the best of games last year, Animal Crossing New Horizons. I feel like a major reason why Animal Crossing New Horizons was even in consideration for Game of the Year was because of the cultural impact that the game had. and its popularity as a whole, but I definitely don't think that it really deserved the nomination with the other games that came out last year. Coming in at number 5, we have The Last of Us Part 2. Again, I really did like The Last of Us Part 2 as a whole. I do not think that it was a bad game whatsoever, like a lot of other people say. But with that being said, I don't think that it was the best game that came out last year. There were a lot of story flaws. I feel like that was the biggest issue. Just some confusion when it came to character development. Either way, still a great game in my opinion, and still definitely deserved the nomination. I don't think it deserved the win, but it did deserve the nomination. Next up at number 4, I think the most underrated game that came out last year, that being Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Just such a fun experience, super great game, and outstanding when it came to visuals and music as well. Very, very smooth and, like I said, very magical feeling game. It just feels otherworldly. Next up though, number 3, we have Hades. The most replayable game I've ever played, as I said before. Great visuals as well, very unique visuals, and of course, nice soundtrack to go along with it, with a very simple but great story with a cast of outstanding characters to really top it off. Now last, we have 1 and 2. The thing is, one of these games I actually like better than the other, but the other one I think is more deserving of Game of the Year, if that makes any sense. What it really comes down to is just how I prioritize certain things in video games. For example, things like music and characters, I feel I prioritize a lot more than most people when it comes to video games. A lot of people, gameplay is really like the big number one, and the other things aren't really as important. And I definitely do get that. I mean, it's a game when it's said and done. But for me personally, I like a full experience, and for me, that includes a great soundtrack. And with that being said, the game that I think should have won Game of the Year is Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima has one of the best stories out of any game I've ever played. Very complete, shows a lot of character development, and has a great cast of characters, along with being a very emotional tale as well. The gameplay is super fun, it has lots of options, it's open world, the visuals are outstanding, and the music is great as well. But with that being said, the game that I personally would have wanted to win Game of the Year is Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think a large factor is simply because the music and the environment is just so fantastic, and I absolutely love the characters in Final Fantasy VII Remake that much more. They're my favorite characters in any video game I've ever played. I love the Final Fantasy VII cast. It's my favorite protagonist and my favorite villain of all time in one game, along with my single favorite video game character with Aerith. So for those reasons, I like Final Fantasy VII Remake more, but like I said, I think Ghost of Tsushima was more deserving. Hopefully you guys could make sense of that. I know it was a little confusing towards the end, but either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and my thoughts on 2020 in gaming as a whole. And please be sure, leave your comments below on your thoughts on any of the games that came out last year, your thoughts on what should have won. I love to see your comments, and again, of course, any critiques you have on this video, I'm definitely willing to hear counter arguments or things that I said that aren't completely true. I absolutely would love to hear them. I, of course, want to make my content better in the future, and we're all here to grow. Yeah, anyways, thank you guys so much for watching to the end. Kevin JSI out. Peace.